there's no better place to talk about the gospel of Jesus Christ than from the Gospels themselves. And so that is where we will be turning our attention to next. And more particularly, what I want to do is I want to talk about the Gospel of Mark this morning. I'm not talking about the Gospel of Mark Morris. That's a completely different fictitious work that hasn't been published yet. I'm talking about the Gospel in the Bible that we refer to as the Gospel of Mark. And in fact, really what this will be is kind of the introduction to a series of lessons where we will talk about the life of Jesus. Our perfect example, our mediator, our master teacher, who has so many great lessons to give us, so many great things to teach us, that we can never tire of looking at His Word. And the Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It's only 16 chapters. And it begins with that simple phrase, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Every Gospel begins in a different way. Matthew begins with a genealogy. Luke begins with a rather lengthy historical prescript. John begins with a discussion about the Word and how the Word pre-existed everything else and how this Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But Mark keeps it simple. Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's a short Gospel, and at perhaps first glance we might ask a question: why? In the Gospel of Mark, if you compare it with other Gospels, you're going to find a lot of things in common. In fact, a large amount of the material that you find in the Gospel of Mark can also be found in the Gospel of Matthew. And I've read estimates as high. Someone once told me 90% of the text of 90% of the text in Mark can be, found in some form in the Gospel of Matthew as well, which kind of makes you wonder, what happened with that other 10%? And I don't know about percentages or whatnot. I haven't done any statistical analysis or things like that. One thing I did do a long time ago was I made a list of all of the stories in the Gospels and kind of tried to figure out, who had what and who didn't have what. And this was a long, ongoing project, still yet unfinished, or you'd have seen the chart by now. But one of the things I noticed is that out of all of the stories that you find in the Gospel, there are only 7 times where Mark has a story that Matthew doesn't. Only 7 instances of that. And when you throw Luke into the mix, that number decreases to 4. There are only 4 stories, if you will, that only appear in the Gospel of Mark, that are unique to the Gospel of Mark. So that's kind of a difficult thing. In fact, I can read all 4 of them for you right now very quickly. In Mark chapter 3, in verses 20 and 21, really kind of a preface to a larger discussion, Jesus came home, and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. And when His own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of Him, for they were saying, "He has lost his senses." And then, of course, this segues into a story found in all of the Gospels about how Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. That was Mark 3, verses 20 and 21. In Mark chapter 4, there's a parable that is not found in any Gospel. In Mark 4, in verses 26 through 29, He was saying that the kingdom of God is like a man who casts seed upon the soil. He goes to bed at night and gets up by day. The seed sprouts and grows. How? He himself does not know. The soil produces crops by itself. First the blade, then the head, then the mature grain in the head. But when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. Well, that's the parable of the harvest. And it's only found in Mark. It's not in Matthew. It's not in Luke. John doesn't really have parables in the sense that we would think about them. Number 3, is a miracle story in Mark chapter 8, in verses 22 through 26. They came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored Him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, He brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying His hands on him, He asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see men. I see them like trees walking around." He again laid His hands on his eyes. He looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And He sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Alright, so that's a miracle story about a blind man that's healed in 2 stages. Kind of a controversial story in its own right, because there were a lot of folks who would read that and they go, "Oh, Jesus had to take 2 tries to heal a blind man? And how many tries does it take you? That's not the point of the story. When Jesus does miracles, it's not just vaguely to demonstrate His power. He's usually making a point behind it. And there's a reason for why this blind man is healed in 2 stages, which we will talk about, Lord willing, when we get to Mark chapter 8. The 4th story, unique to Mark, can't find it in any other gospel, is in Mark chapter 14, when Jesus is being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's just kind of a little detail thrown in at the end of the arrest in verses 51 and 52. A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. They seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. And most people are surprised to find out that's in the Bible, but that's there. And it's only in Mark, and nobody really understands why. There's a lot of discussion as to why that's there. But that's pretty much it. There's other stories that have additional details thrown in them. Like, for instance, in the feeding of the 5,000, for some reason, Mark is the only gospel to mention that the grass that they sat down on was green. I don't know why he felt the need to point out that it was green, but no other gospel does that. It raises a question about why we would choose to study this gospel that's missing so much stuff and includes so very little. I dare say that none of those 4 stories, Jesus losing his senses, the parable of the harvest, the 2-stage healing of the blind man, and the naked young man who flees from Jesus' arrest, doubt very much that anyone here is saying that any one of those stories is particularly foundational to your life or to your faith as a Christian. You can't really see the evident lesson, I can go apply this on Monday morning at the factory. And most of them are rarely preached about or talked about, actually, in all fairness. And then you contrast that with all the stuff that Mark doesn't have. He doesn't mention the birth of Jesus. He doesn't mention, he barely mentions the baptism and temptation. They're greatly abbreviated. There's no mention of Jesus' first sermon at Nazareth. No mention of the great catch of fish from Luke chapter 5. No mention of Jesus healing the servant of the centurion from a long distance. No comments about the dead burying their own dead. No healing of the 2 blind men or of the mute demon-possessed man. No call to send workers into the harvest. The harvest is plentiful. The laborers are few. But Mark didn't see need to mention that. No healing of the no instance of John the Baptist sending his disciples from prison to ask questions about Jesus as to whether he is the expected one. There's no description of Jesus being the chosen servant of Isaiah chapter 53. There is no... Jesus does walk on the water in the Gospel of Mark, but you know who doesn't? Peter is not mentioned walking on the water. The famous part of the story where Peter gets out of the boat and tries to walk to Jesus. That part's not in Mark. Moving on, there's no stories about coins in fishes' mouths, no encounters of Zacchaeus, no parable of the talents or parable of the minas, depending on whether you're reading Matthew or Luke. No parable of the 11th hour workers, no parable of the 2 sons, no parable of the wedding feast, no reference to Judas' suicide, no trial before Herod, no conversion of the thief on the cross, and no mention of the guard that was at the tomb of Jesus. All of those things I just said, not in the Gospel of Mark. And we could probably think of other things. That's probably not even an exhaustive list. It's a lot of omissions for 4 stories that most people don't study very often. And so it raises the question, why study Mark at all? But actually, that's not the real question we should be asking. The real question we should be asking is, why did God want us to read this? We need to think about why God put things in the Bible that He did. Because it's not always immediately evident. There's always this tendency, the sermon has to tell me what I should be changing about my life on Monday morning. It's the real road of the Christian, the sober-minded Christian, is not radical changes in your life every week. If it is, that's a lot of flip-flopping and looping around and whatnot. The real life of the Christian is coming to know God. Not just to know about God, but to know God. To know the God who gave us the Scriptures. Who was trying to tell us something about Himself. Who was trying to reach out to us and communicate with us. To have that relationship with the Lord, where we are able to talk freely with Him in prayer and to listen freely to what He says to us in the Scriptures. I do think the fact that Mark is in the Bible is a direct affront to some of these composite life of Christ studies that we sometimes see, or that people are sometimes keen on creating. And don't get me wrong, there's value in trying to, look at the Gospels together. There's value in seeing chronology and things like that. But the fact is, when you sit down and you say, well, here, I'm going to take all the stories, like I just described to you I was doing, take all the stories and arrange them and figure out what order they're supposed to be in so I can have one super gospel. Am I really going to deceive myself into thinking that the super gospel that I have written is better than the 4 that the Lord has written? If it's such a smart idea, why didn't God do it that way? The fact that Mark exists, the fact that Mark was preserved, needs to provoke thought in us. Are there times when less is more? Are there times when there are things that we just don't need to hear straight away? Is there value in a selective presentation of the life of Jesus? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. Of course there is. Otherwise we wouldn't have the Gospel of Mark. How long does it take to read the Gospel of Mark? You can read it in less than 2 hours? And someone will say, well, I'm not that fast of a reader. If you're not that fast of a reader, there's a thing called audio Bibles. And you know what the great thing about audio Bibles is? The average audio Bible, I looked it up, the average audio Bible track for the Gospel of Mark, around an hour and a half. That's less time than you spend watching an average movie. The Gospel of Mark can be read very quickly. It can be read in one sitting, or it can be heard in one sitting. And it's the story of Jesus. And there's benefit in seeing the big picture and seeing it together. When we did our Bible reading meetups, we were first starting out, it was over a year ago now, and we asked the question, what's the first book we're going to read? Let's read the Gospel of Mark. It took 2 sessions to read the Gospel of Mark. And it was very interesting, I thought, to see all of it at once, and very personally edifying for me. I hope it was for everyone else that was there as well, because you got to see the life of Jesus spelled out in such a way. You see it all in one place. You don't get lost in the forest. You don't get lost in the details. And you have a better understanding of just what it was that Jesus came to do, and just who it was that was coming to do it. Let's talk a little bit about the Gospel of Mark. The word Mark, the name Mark, never actually appears in the Gospel. And so, in fact, all of the Gospels are anonymous. Matthew doesn't mention Matthew as the author. Mark doesn't mention Mark at all. Luke doesn't mention Luke as the author. It's obvious somebody's writing it because it's there. John hints at who the author is, but it's all hints, and he doesn't ever explicitly... You can figure out who wrote John by which disciple he's constantly not naming. Because he says Peter and Andrew and James and that other disciple that Jesus loved. Who's writing this gospel? And you see, figure out, process of elimination. John wrote the Gospel of John. But the other Gospels, it's unmentioned. And so the fact that the name Mark is affixed to it is, to some degree, the product of tradition. Granted, if you're going to stick somebody's name on it and you don't know who wrote it, you might try to stick somebody slightly more famous on it. Which the fact that Mark is not very well known and kind of a minor character in the background of so many scriptures, means that there's probably a certain authenticity to this. Mark, probably John Mark, and he's mentioned in various places in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, for instance, it was his house in Jerusalem that the people were meeting in to pray in while Peter was in prison. In Acts chapter 12, in verse 12. He traveled with Paul and Barnabas. In Acts 12:25, he traveled from Jerusalem to Antioch. In Acts 13, he went with them on their first missionary journey to Cyprus. But then when they sailed to Perga, Mark departed from them. And then this led to a problem, because on the second missionary journey, when Barnabas wanted to take Mark again, and Paul didn't want to take Mark again because Mark is just going to desert us halfway through the trip, this provokes an argument, and Mark traveled with Barnabas and Paul traveled with Silas. That's in Acts chapter 15 and verses 37 through 39. But somebody grew up. I don't know if Mark grew up or Paul grew up. That's a whole other sermon in and of itself. But at some point, Mark is with Paul again. Because in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, Paul mentions that Mark is with him in Rome, all places, while Paul's in prison. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11, Paul describes Mark as useful to him. Mark was also apparently with Peter. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 13, Peter calls him my son. And Peter likely wrote that. Peter says he writes from Babylon, but owing as the fact that the actual city of Babylon is very much deserted at the time, you're looking more likely at the fact that Babylon is a metonymy for Rome, which is where every tradition we have places Peter in that time period. Mark's association with Peter led to a widespread belief that he was in fact writing the gospel as a summary of Peter's own teachings and experiences about Jesus. And there's a whole bunch of quotes from ancient guys, long dead, which I've written out on this paper, which I'm not going to read here for want of time, except just to say that there's a lot of ancient writings that associate Peter with Mark and then claim that, this gospel is really the gospel of Peter, but Mark's the one that wrote it down, or wrote it down based after the fact. And I don't know about that. I wasn't there. We have it as it is, in brief form. Mark has some interesting features about it. There's always, every other sermon I've ever heard on Mark argues that it was written for the Romans. Maybe. It's possible. I wouldn't rule that out if it was written in Rome, and the fact that it contains various Latin-isms. But admittedly, we don't know that. Mark does like the word immediately. He uses it a lot. In fact, Mark uses the word immediately so much that it accounts for almost half of the usage of that word in the New Testament, in what is otherwise not that long of a book. And so, you have this constant, fast-paced action narrative. So, for instance, in Mark chapter 11, Mark chapter 1, Jesus is calling the disciples, and Jesus says, "Follow me, I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. He sees James and John, the son of Zebedee, they're mending their nets, and he calls them, verse 20, immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee. In verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue, began to teach. It was Thursday, and then immediately it was the Sabbath. We just skipped a couple of days to get there, but so there's this kind of this immediacy, this rushing, and it's constantly taking place throughout the Gospel of Mark. It's the action-packed, and perhaps that explains why it's so brief, is because of, again, the fast-paced nature of the narrative. It's not like you would think of a normal biography. If you're going to write a biography about somebody's life, are you only going to focus on 1 or 2 years of their life, or are you going to focus on their entire life? If you were going to write a biography about a guy like Abraham Lincoln, for instance, and you open the biography up, and the only thing it talks about is the year 1865. That's the year he was shot. So, it's all over now. A lot of stuff happened that year, sure, led up to that event, but, it's kind of like, well, what about the other stuff he did? What about the rest of his presidency? What about the rest of his life? But you come to Jesus, you read the Gospels are not a complete account in the life of Jesus like we would come to expect of them. In fact, Mark pretty much avoids talking about Jesus' birth and childhood and parentage. Joseph is completely unmentioned. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is only mentioned once in passing in Mark chapter 6 and verse 3. Instead, Mark keeps things bare bones. He keeps things confined really to that last year of Jesus' life. Maybe the baptism and the temptation would fall outside of that particular time frame, but that's over with in the first 13 verses. Mark follows a skeleton of a story. A skeleton very akin to what we find in the preaching of the apostles in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 10, in verses 36 through 39, we have a story of when Peter came to Cornelius to preach there. And amidst the sermon that Peter's preaching is this statement. Now, in verse 36, "The word which he sent to the sons of Israel, preaching peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. You yourselves know the thing which took place throughout all Judea, starting from Galilee, after the baptism which John proclaimed. You know of Jesus of Nazareth, how God anointed him with the Holy Spirit and with power, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We are witnesses of all the things he did, both in the land of Jews and in Jerusalem. They also put him to death by hanging him on a cross. God raised him up from the dead, and granted that he become visible, not to all people, but to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God, that is, to us, who ate and drank with him after he arose from the dead." So there you have this picture, this kind of just a skeletal story of the gospel, a very quick summary. But that's the framework for the Gospel of Mark. Peter doesn't feel the need to talk about who Jesus' parents were, or he doesn't feel the need to talk about Jesus' childhood, or he doesn't feel the need to talk about birth. I mean, those things happen, and they're important. But he gives this simple presentation because he's trying to convert Cornelius. He's trying to show him who this man Jesus was, and why he should consider baptizing himself into Christ. Why he should be part of this. Why he should have faith in Christ. Because that's ultimately what this is about. The simple message of the gospel of Jesus compels a response from us. Paul has a similar summary of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15. This is of first importance, that Christ died according to the Scriptures, and then He was buried, and then He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And then He appeared. He appeared to witnesses, and Paul lists off those witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15. And that's the gospel. And the gospel compels a response of having faith in Jesus, repenting of one's sins, and being immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins. But that gospel is first and foremost the story of Jesus. The proclamation of the kingdom of God, the rule of God that is broken into this world through the person of Jesus Christ. That's why simple is better. That's why Mark chapter 1 and verse 1 is really the starting point. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And when he says that, he's not just titling the book. He's actually telling you kind of, and implicitly he's kind of giving you a two-stage outline of what he's doing. The phrase, Jesus Christ, throughout the Gospel of Mark, there are only two humans who confess Jesus. There's a lot of demons that confess Him, but there's only two humans that make an explicit confession of Jesus, or that are recorded to make an explicit confession of Jesus in Mark. The first one is in Mark chapter 8. In Mark chapter 8, in verse 29, Jesus is having a conversation with His disciples. He asked them the question in verse 27, who do people say that I am? They told Him saying, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets. He continued by questioning, who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to them, you are the Christ. Now, other versions have a slightly longer answer. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Christ of God. Mark just says, you are the Christ. There's only one other confession made, and it's at the end of the Gospel of Mark, in Mark chapter 15, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, and He has breathed His last, and the temple veil has been torn, and the earth has shaken. In Mark chapter 15, in verse 39, when the centurion who was standing in front of Him saw the way He breathed His last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. The beginning of the gospel, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And in fact, what this is, there is, like I said before, a twofold outline. The first section, 8 chapters, dealing with who Jesus is. And the end result, Peter comes to this question, comes to the conclusion, you are the Christ. But the second section deals with a different question. We know Jesus is the Christ. What did the Christ come to do? What did the Messiah come to do? What did the Anointed One come to do on this earth? There's a lot of ideas about what the Christ's job was, about why He would come, about what His mission was. Was He there to start an uprising, to overthrow the Romans, to overpower the evil forces that were holding the Jewish nation under their thumb, to inaugurate a new golden age where they rebuild the temple, and the temple was already rebuilt, but where they reestablish the Davidic kingdom in all of its glory? That's what a lot of Jews in Jesus' day were expecting. That's what the disciples were expecting. But lo and behold, like the blind man healed in 2 stages, they see dimly. They understand Jesus is the Christ, but they don't yet see clearly. Haven't had their eyes completely open. They have to get the impression of just what that is about, what that means. Jesus is the Christ. And in fact, the second section, chapters 9 through 16, it is the second confession that is prompted by the death of Jesus on the cross. Because that is what the Messiah came to do. He didn't come to overthrow the Romans. He came to overthrow Satan. He didn't come to fix the problem of national oppression. He came to fix the problem of sin. He didn't come to lead an uprising. He came to lead people to the throne of God. There's another tendency that Mark has, and it's very unusual. And it's to some extent it's in other Gospels, but in Mark it's really pronounced. That Jesus, because in all the Gospels Jesus has a tendency to answer questions cryptically, or to, how many times does somebody ask Jesus a question and then he doesn't really answer what they asked? He, it says something that provokes a bunch of other questions. But in Mark, there's a decisive emphasis on outright keeping secrets from people. Jesus does these amazing things, and then He tells His disciples, shh, don't tell anyone about this. And so, for instance, you have in Mark 1 in verses 43 and 44, after Jesus heals a man from leprosy, He cleanses him from leprosy, and in verse 43, He sternly warned him, immediately sent him away, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Of course, what winds up happening is the guy, he's not going to keep his mouth shut. He's just been cleansed of leprosy. He goes and tells everybody. And then Jesus, of course, has a problem of being able to go appear publicly because people are flocking to Him asking to be healed. Whenever a demon-possessed person starts confessing Jesus as the Christ, the Holy One of God. For example, earlier in that same chapter 1, what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus doesn't tolerate that kind of talk. Verse 25, Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. Keep the demons quiet. They're saying too much. Verse 34, same thing. He healed many who were ill with various diseases and cast out many demons. He was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who He was. Who was He? He's the Son of God. He's the Christ. So Mark's supposed to bring us to this conclusion that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But Jesus is constantly trying to keep this idea under wraps, trying to keep it secret from everybody. He goes on. In Mark chapter 5, Jairus, the synagogue official, has a daughter who dies. And Jesus shows up at their house and raises her from the dead. Now, if you were raised from the dead, if your daughter just got raised from the dead, what would you do? Well, Jesus says in Mark 5, verse 43, He gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And He said something should be given her to eat. Now, it's important that she eat, but don't tell anybody. Even Jesus' teaching is done with so much crypticism. He talks to His audience in parables constantly. And He tells His disciples the reason for this. In verse 11 in Mark 4, to you it has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but those who are outside get everything in parables. I'm telling you, but I'm keeping it secret from everybody else. Again, in verses 33 and 34 of Mark 4, with many such parables, He was speaking the word to them, the crowds, so far as they were able to hear it, and He did not speak to them without a parable, but He was explaining everything privately to His own disciples. Everything is being kept secret. And we just read Peter's confession. Peter says, you are the Christ. And what's Jesus' response? All right, that's good. You got the right answer, Peter. Now I want you to go tell other people about it, right? Is that what He said? No. Mark 8, verse 30, He warned them to tell no one about Him. Don't tell anyone about this. Then a little later, they go up on a mountain. And Jesus is transformed before their eyes. And they see Moses and they see Elijah. There's a real shocker for you, right? Would you tell somebody about that kind of scene? And the cloud out of heaven appears, and a voice speaks, this is my beloved Son. Listen to Him. And what's the next thing Jesus tells them to listen to? Mark 9, verse 9, as they're coming down the mountain, He gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So we're not keeping it secret forever. We're just keeping it secret until after the resurrection. Wait, resurrection? What's going on? And this is where it gets interesting. Jesus is keeping all this stuff secret. But here, there's one thing He keeps telling His disciples in the second half of the gospel. He keeps telling His disciples this thing very plainly to their face. that the Son of Man is going to die and be raised from the dead. And he tells it to them several times very plainly, and each time goes right over their head. Goes in one ear, out the other. They don't get it. And that's the plainest statement he can make. He doesn't tell that in a parable. Mark 8, verses 31 and 32, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days he will rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay. No, that's downer talk, Jesus. I don't know what that rebuke would have seemed like. Jesus rebukes Peter right back. Mark 9. In verses 30 and 31, from there they went out and began to go through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know about it, but he was telling his disciples and he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. But they did not understand this statement and were afraid to ask him. Mark 10. Verses 32 and through 34. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking on ahead of them. They were amazed. Those who followed were fearful. That's another thing we could look at in Mark, by the way. You know, how many times people are scared of stuff that Jesus does throughout this gospel. They were fearful. He again took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death, will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, spit on him, and scourge him, and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise again. That's pretty pointed. And still they don't get it. And if the disciples, who were so close to Jesus and understood that he was the Christ, did not understand the very plain statement of his purpose that he was giving them, how much more the masses who thought that the Christ was there to do something completely different? They thought he was there, to build some kind of earthly kingdom for themselves, some kind of dominion, for the Jewish nation, something to satisfy their patriotic indulgences. But instead, what do they get? They get a Christ whose idea of leadership is to go die for the sins of his people. It's not something that anybody was ready to hear, and ever would have been ready to hear. But it's what happened. There's one other bit in Mark chapter 16. In Mark chapter 16, and this is... Now the ending of Mark is, a complicated issue in and of itself that I'm not going to get into this morning because it's just not the point. But there is a paragraph break between verses 8 and 9. At the very least, we'll give that. So let's read the first 8 verses of Mark 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. Notice that she's called Mary, the mother of James. It's not singling her out as the mother of Jesus here. Interesting point in and of itself. Very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. They were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. He said to them, do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. You didn't see this coming, guys? He told you. He told you he would rise from the dead, and you're going to meet him in Galilee. But then something interesting happens in verse 8. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, the story doesn't end there. And we know the story doesn't end there, because if it did, then we wouldn't be reading about it. I mean, but the reader's kind of like, wait, what? The women didn't tell anyone? Jesus spent half the gospel trying to shut people up and get them to not talk about miracles, and now he's risen from the dead and they don't want to talk about it. The women's initial response is not to say anything to anyone? Well, we know it didn't stay that way forever. But there's a lesson for us too. I mean, Here we see all these miracles, people who can't help but tell about Jesus even though he told them not to. Why? Because they were so compelled by the wonder and the awe of what had happened to them. They were so compelled. I mean, the guy with the leprosy. Jesus tells him to keep his mouth shut, but would you be able to? I don't think I would have. So, how much more? Us, recipients of the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Us who benefit from His death. Us who benefit from His resurrection. He who was delivered over for our transgressions and raised for our justification. What is our reaction to that? When we look at the empty tomb, look at the proclamation that Jesus is risen from the dead, and draw the conclusion that we should say nothing to anyone? Why? Because I'm afraid? Well, what real conclusion should we draw? The other statement, in verse 15, the longer ending of Mark, go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned. That's the message of the Lord right there. Proclaim the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to all creation. So that's how the Gospel of Mark ends, with a charge to us, the readers. How will we respond to the resurrection of Jesus? How will we respond to what He has done in our lives? If there's anyone here this morning, they have not been baptized as Jesus instructed, or perhaps they have not lived a life in conformity with the new life that we are supposed to have in His resurrection. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, urges us, compels us to live a certain way, to draw ever nearer to the Lord who saved us. If you want to draw nearer to Him, and there's some way we can help you do that this morning, now is an appropriate time to let that be known. Well, together we stand and we sing the song selected.